pals, I'm here today to do another recommendation video. I have lots and lots of recommendation videos lined up, and I'm hoping to try and do at least 2 every month from now on for about the next year or so. So yeah, lots on the list, so I hope you're enjoying these. This one is if you liked this book, you should read this book, which means I'm going to talk about 10 more popular, well-known, well-received books that I think a lot of you will have read, and if not, you'll definitely have heard of. And I'm going to talk about 10 lesser known or just lesser well-read books that I really enjoyed and think have similarities to those 10 popular books. So I'm going to crack on because there's 20 books to talk about. The first big buzzy book I'm going to talk about is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. I listened to this one on audio, which I would 100% recommend. I had a blast listening to this one. The narrator does a brilliant job. As I'm sure you know, the premise of this is that we're following a woman in her, I think, late 20s who is a babysitter for a child in a white family, and she is a young black woman, and there is a moment at the start of the novel that sort of like shifts all their perceptions, and the novel comments on race relations, class relations, and also being at that age when people are expecting more from you, when people are sort of expecting the babysitting to be your side hustle and not the thing you want to carry on doing as a career. And the book it really made me think of is Win Me Something by Carl Lucia Wu. I really enjoyed this book, and I've barely seen anyone talk about it, so I'd love more people to pick it up. This came out in 2021, so it's a fairly recent-ish release. The premise of this is it opens with our protagonist, Willa Chen, being a sort of young teen, and we follow her for about, I don't know, maybe 70 pages at the start of the novel. We follow her as a teenager as she struggles. She is biracial Chinese American, but she is raised predominantly by her white mother, and her mother has another family with more children, and her father has another family with other daughters, and she feels sort of lost at sea in like which family she belongs to, but also like what race she belongs to. She feels no connection to either race, and in both groups she feels apart. And then we jump forward many years to when she's in her 20s, and she is a babysitter for a young child in a white family. The difference is that she's a live-in babysitter, so the stakes feel quite a lot higher than they do in Such a Fun Age. And I will say this has less plot than Such a Fun Age. You know, the inciting incident of that book sort of opens the gates running, and you're trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And this isn't like that, but I had this sense of unease throughout reading this, because the people she works for, she becomes sort of obsessed with imitating, and she starts to blur the lines of whether she's family or a service provider, which makes it even harder when you live with people to figure out where that line is. But also the uncle of the child she's caring for starts to develop this sort of odd relationship with her. He 100% sort of like racially stereotypes her, and he says things that are 100% racist remarks, but then he'll cloak them in a, oh, it's just a joke, you understand what I'm trying to say. And because our character is so at sea with who she is as an individual, she's really unsure who she is, what she wants to do, if she has any connections with people. She sort of lets these things happen to her and lets people treat her quite poorly. And you watch as tensions grow and more little things start to happen, and you start to think, God, like, where is this going to go at the end? And so it has a lot of similar themes, but I think deals with them with a very different protagonist. In Such a Fun Age, our protagonist always feels very capable and confident and aware of who she is, and she's surrounded by lots of friends, and that's very different in this book. Our character feels very lost and at sea, and she feels like somebody who doesn't have connections to anybody and doesn't really know how to build those connections. But I really enjoyed this. I'd 100% recommend it. I think it's really beautifully written, and I'll definitely be reading whatever this author brings out next. The next buzzy book I read in 2016 when it came out, so forgive me if I don't remember lots about this one, and it's definitely one I want to reread as soon as possible, and that is Commonwealth by Ann Patchett. This remains my favourite Ann Patchett novel out of all the ones of hers I've read, though I do still have a few to go. This opens with a christening of a baby in this family, and the mother of that baby goes into a room at the christening and kisses the father from another family who are present at the christening, and that moment sort of fractures both these families, and from then on you watch as that moment splits both the families and sort of creates these different families, right? And both families have quite a few children, and you then follow their lives. And there is a sort of big secret that you're following throughout this book that's gradually revealed, and you're following from quite a few different perspectives. And I just remember reading this with like my heart in my mouth, not being able to figure out where it was going, being deeply fascinated by all these sort of tangled connections these characters had, and all the moments where you know some people in the room know more than they're letting on, and you know some other people in the room are just completely unaware of sort of the undercurrents in the room because they don't know about the secrets. And I just remember like inhaling this and really loving the ride and figuring out all these secrets and all the characters figuring out everything. And when I was reading earlier this year Love Marriage by Monica Elliott, it really made me think of Commonwealth. This has a smaller cast of characters, but it again has the idea of these two families coming together and there being these secrets that one character in particular is trying to uncover. So we're watching a young woman who is from a sort of Indian British family, and she is engaged to marry a white British man, and it's about her parents meeting his mother. That's how the book opens. And she's terrified because her family are quite traditional and you know, don't like seeing lewd things on the television, don't swear, whereas her fiance's mother is a sort of left-wing feminist. She's had photos taken nude in the press, and she's very radical and very loud with her opinions. So you think when you open the book that that's going to be the drama. The drama is going to be her trying to get her parents and her soon-to-be mother-in-law to get on, and you very quickly realise that is not what the drama is going to be. Because quite quickly, her soon-to-be mother-in-law forms a relationship with her mother, which reveals things to our protagonist about her mother that she never knew. And she's been convinced her whole life that her parents had a love marriage rather than an arranged marriage, which is more traditional for their background. And you realise quite early on as a reader that you don't think that's the case, but it takes our protagonist a long while to catch up. So this book follows the love marriage of her parents as you find out what really happened, and it follows her mother in the present as she lets herself be the person she sort of wanted to be and has hidden for a lot of years from her husband and her children. And you also follow this like soon-to-be marriage of our protagonist and her fiance as she realises that this may not be what she wants, and she sort of does all these crazy things that you're like, oh, don't know if this is going to go well. And a big part of this novel that I really enjoyed is that she is a doctor in the NHS, and you're watching her really struggle with the cutbacks that the NHS has. Her father's also a doctor and there's a lot of pressure there. And I found this book gave me a similar feel to Commonwealth. You know, when you're reading this book and you don't necessarily like all the characters you're reading about, you certainly don't like the protagonist in this novel, and I remember there being some characters I really didn't like in this one. But yet you're sort of still rooting for them, and you want to know the secret, you think you know it, but you can't wait for the moment when it's revealed to the characters. And both of these novels really had that feel to me. They're just both excellent family dramas, really handle the themes well, and also just felt like really easy, brilliantly written books. Do you know what I mean? When you can tell that a writer is very skilled at their craft, but yet you can just speed through these books. Like, I read this really, really fast, and I remember doing this with this one as well, so definitely recommend both of those. And the next book that you have probably heard of, although this one is definitely less popular than the previous ones I've read, is A Song for Issy by Cara Spray. I read all of Cara Spray's books, and this remains like one of her best, I think. If you haven't read this one and you enjoy family dramas, I definitely recommend this, although this is a very sad book, so like, hear what I say about the blurb, and if you think, not for me, I don't blame you. The premise of this is we're following a family, like in contemporary times, and they are a Mormon family, and their daughter, Issy Bradley, at the start of the novel, gets very, very ill, and it is about the care they are unsure they want her to have via the NHS because of their beliefs, and they're really conflicted because of that. You follow all members of the family, the mother, the father and the siblings at separate points, and you see all of their opinions on what should be happening, the guilt they feel, the adherence they feel to their beliefs, how they feel to one another, and all these unsaid things. This book is filled with unsaid things, and it is a heartbreaking book. It's a brilliant examination of the ways in which a family can have the same belief system but all feel slightly different about it, and the ways in which people can feel bound by, I guess, a doctrine that they adhered to before they experienced certain things that would make them not want to adhere to it. I really, really love this, and I'd highly recommend it. And yeah, just love all of her books, she's really great. And a book that really made me think of that is The Friday Gospels by Jen Ashworth. Now, both these authors grew up Mormon and have since left their faith, and you can really sense that in these books. This again is following a family of Mormons. They live in Lancashire, which is sort of a bit northern of where I live in the UK. And we are following them. At the moment, their son is coming back from his 2-year mission. He's been in Utah, and he's coming back, and they're all really excited. But again, you realise quite early on that they're all carrying some secrets, and even though they come across as a family that are really loving and caring and really integral part of the community, actually they don't talk to one another about anything that really matters, and they're all holding these things really deep within themselves that they're all desperately sad about. And you watch from the different perspectives as things are set in motion because of these secrets they keep from one another. I particularly remember the daughter's storyline being really difficult to read in this book. So if you struggle with books where you're watching characters and you're thinking, no, that like you could so easily not let this happen if like you did this, then like this is a book you might not want to read. I found it a really difficult read in that regard, even though at all points I understood why these people, with their beliefs and their fears, would act in these ways. And I think both of these books not only were like a study of these Mormon families, but also were a really interesting study of just quite traditional families, but also working class families. And both these families really reminded me of one another. The children in this family are slightly older, so you're dealing more with like late teen, early adults, whereas in this the children are all a bit younger and the focus is more on the parents. I really enjoyed both of these, and I think if you enjoyed one, you definitely enjoyed the other. The next party book I'm going to talk about is Luster by Raven and Lanny. I didn't love this book as much as a lot of the other books I'm going to talk about, but I still definitely enjoyed it, and I see why a lot of people did really love it. And the book it made me think of is English Animals by Laura Kay. I read this book years ago when it came out, and I've meant to reread it since then. I absolutely loved this book. The premise of this is we follow this young woman who has come over a couple of years ago from Slovakia, and she's been doing sort of odd job, temp jobs after this sort of big break with her family, and she just wanted a fresh start and decided to come to London. And she sees an advert in the paper for a job working for this married couple who have this area of land and a farm, and she thinks it's to be a nanny. And when she gets there, she's like, oh, you know, where's the child? And they're like, oh, no, we want you to sort of do lots of odd jobs. The husband is a taxidermist, and she learns that profession, so like content warnings for taxidermy, and has this really deep connection with him in learning that. And the wife is trying to start a wedding business on their property, so they're sort of renting the property out, and they're like making all the flowers and things like that, and she's supposed to be assisting the wife in doing that. But she becomes very tangled up in their marriage, which is very reminiscent of Luster. You know, in Luster, she's put in a situation with his wife where she's a bit like, oh, this is weird, like, does she know the full story, what's going on here? And this is a very similar situation, but the difference in this is that our protagonist is a queer woman, and she very quickly feels like she has a really deep connection with both the husband and the wife, and she's not quite sure where the lines are with how they feel about her. And I don't want to spoil anything, but this book gets very, very messy. They're a very toxic couple, and she's really sort of deeply enmeshed, not only in all the sort of financial and business discussions, but also the discussions about everything to do with their marriage. They don't ever shy away from having any discussions in front of her, and she really gets pulled in and tangled up in all that. So all of that really reminded me of Luster, but like I said, I definitely enjoyed this book more. And one other thing I really enjoyed about this novel is the discussions of when you learn a language, it's really difficult to learn the puns. And I was reading a book the other day where that came up a lot, and it really reminded me of this book. So this couple are very wealthy and sort of upper middle class, up from old money, but you know, are relatively cash poor at the moment. But they use a lot of like traditionally British puns, and our protagonist has no clue what they're talking about. And it's really interesting. She starts doing the crossword, and throughout the novel she gets better at speaking English and learns all those puns, and because it's from her perspective, puns become more a part of the narrative as you get further in, because she's getting better at using all those like random British sayings, which is something I really enjoyed. And I had never really thought about how difficult it must be to pick up all those nuances in a language, like not just learning the language, but learning like these odd sayings we have in each language. So yeah, highly recommend this one. The next buzzy book I want to talk about is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. I really enjoyed this book, I think a lot of us did. And that book really made me think about what it means to be a parent, what we mean when we say the word mother, and what we expect that role to comprise of, and what it takes for somebody to be a mother. Like, what do they have to do to earn that role? And, you know, how much can that participation continue as the child grows? And the book that I've just read, which really made me think really deeply on all those themes, is The Other Mother by Rachel M. Harper. I will say, caveat here, I would recommend reading this book in the autumn in your country, because this is set September to December in the US, and it felt really autumnal, so I regret reading it in the summer. And the premise of this is the book opens with our protagonist, who's a young man. He's just started college at Brown University, and he has gone there specifically because he was raised by his mother, who told him that his father died when he was 2 years old, and she would never talk about anything to do with his father other than to say he was a very successful professional ballet dancer and that he himself had gone to Brown University. So he gets there and he finds out that his grandfather is still alive and working at Brown, and in the first chapter he goes and meets his grandfather, introduces himself and says, "I'd like to know more about my father, your son." And his grandfather is like, "I don't know why you're asking me about my son, you should be asking me about your daughter. My son was nothing to you, but my daughter was your other mother." And he's like, "What the hell?" And from that point the book splits and you get a narrative from his mother who raised him, from the other mother, and from other members of the family until you get to like the conclusion of the novel. And this book is about this queer couple, these two women, one of whom carries the child and one of whom doesn't, and the different roles they see themselves inhabiting. And everybody in this novel makes mistakes, like nobody is faultless. It's one of those novels where you read from all perspectives and you're like, oh no, I see your point of view, oh no, I see yours. And it is an intensely difficult discussion about what it means to be a parent, what is an inherited trait, and what it means to a child to know who their parents are. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily even come to any conclusions. I think it's like more of a meditation on these themes. It has such similar discussions as we do in Detransition Baby, but just with a different type of couple and looking at a child that has already been born and many years later is being told all this stuff and all these secrets are being revealed. So definitely recommend. The next buzzy book is one of my all-time favourite books, and that is Small Island by Andrea Levy. If you haven't read this book and you enjoy historical fiction, what have you been doing? It has to be like one of the absolute best novels I've ever read. On audio it is performed brilliantly by the author. If you don't know, this novel is told from four perspectives. It is set in the years after World War II, but the book starts to sort of look back on what happened to get all these characters to the point they're at. And we're following a married couple from Jamaica and a married couple from England, and they're all really linked with one another, and it is phenomenal. The book I would recommend if you enjoyed Small Island is This Lovely City by Louise Hare. This book is also set in London just after World War II, and this book has this sort of inciting incident. We're following a man called Laurie, who is a jazz musician, and he's also a postman, and he deals with lots of racism in the area, but he has pinned all his hopes on a young woman who he has met through delivering her post and who he's fallen in love with. She is mixed race, she's been raised by her white mother, but she knows that her father was black, doesn't know much more about him than that. And so he has this dream of building this lovely life with her in this quite hostile environment. But there is an event that happens where a drowned mixed race baby is found in a local pond in a park in London, and immediately all black men in London, the black men are more targeted than the black women, are targeted by the police, and Laurie's sort of caught up in all of that because he was one of the people who found the baby in the pond. And people immediately start to think that because he is a black man and he was on the scene when this baby was found, it was probably him that did it. And then the book starts to go back in time, which is very similar to what Small Island does, and looks at all these character stories and how they all came to be there. So it looks at sort of the Windrush generation, the people who came over thinking they were going to build this brilliant life in England and they were going to be welcomed with open arms, and how that isn't what happened. But we also look into the story of his girlfriend and her mother and how she came to be, and we learn about everybody's prejudices, but also their fears and their sort of deepest, darkest secrets. And it's a really readable novel, which Small Island is as well. All the characters I think are really well rounded, and some of the reveals in this were really shocking and were not what I was expecting at all. So it's not like an easy read by any means. It is at points quite a sad book, but one I really enjoyed and yeah, really reminded me of Small Island, so I definitely recommend it. The next Buzzy book is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I'm sure you've read this book, and if not, you've definitely heard of it. This book is told in sort of trios of short stories, and I absolutely love this, and I'd be happy to read way more books like it. So in each trio we get a story from 3 women who are known to one another in some way. Sometimes they're related, like in one there is a teacher, her student, and then maybe like the mother of the student. And you get to see sometimes them at the same time and their perspectives of one another, and sometimes them at different times. And it was a really great discussion about gender, the patriarchy, race, the different choices people make, and the reason people make mistakes that are sometimes hurtful to others. And in large part it was about, to me, the importance of women's lives to one another and what a big difference women can make to one another, and they can choose to sort of make or break one another. And a book that really reminded me of that is If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. I loved this book. It was one that I held off reading for a while, so I was just hearing so much good stuff about it. I was a bit like, is it going to be that good? And it really was for me. It was such a readable book. I would pre-order anything this author brought out in the future. I really loved it. This book is set in Seoul in South Korea, and we're following a group of women. Predominantly there is, I think, 4 friends, and there is then a perspective from a woman who also lives in their building. They live in like a apartment building, and they all have these quite different lives, and some of them have a history together. And the book is really commenting on beauty in particular, the title If I Had Your Face, and it's about the idea of the lives these women not only have chose to lead, but they feel they can lead with their sort of background in terms of class, but a lot of it is a discussion in terms of how they look, especially in regards to the colour of their skin, how light their skin is, how westernised they look. And a lot of these women have work done to themselves to make themselves look more westernised. And it's a discussion about how a lot of this thoughts they have about the way they look and what beauty is fed to them by the patriarchy. And actually it's not women themselves who have chosen to look this way, it's that they've been fed this story by the Western world, but also, like I said, by the patriarchy. And as this book unfolds, you hear more and more about perhaps all these women are unhappy in different ways, and even though they could be jealous of another one, actually none of them are really feeling fulfilled or happy in their lives. And then it sort of builds to you finding out more about all their past and how they're all tied together. I really love this. I thought it was an excellent exploration of the lives women can lead, and particularly, like, I haven't read many books about Korean women, so I found that really beautiful. And yeah, I just found this so... I loved all the scenes where they were together, but I also loved all the scenes where they were apart and they were living this life that you knew the other one wanted. I thought that was all really fascinating, and I'd highly recommend this book. The next Buzzy book is a massive one, and that is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Again, if you enjoy historical fiction and you haven't read this one, what have you been doing? This is one of the greats. This book is set post-World War II, and it is set in the English countryside during a summer. And I'm going to mention The Offing by Benjamin Myers, which is post-World War II, set in the English countryside during the summer. These books have some quite stark differences, but I think in theme and in writing style they have a lot of similarities. So in The Remains of the Day you follow an English butler who has been the head butler to this sort of massive country estate at a time when all these country estates are really losing money, and also public opinion about that sort of inherited wealth is starting to shift. And he's realising there might be a big change going forward for him, and also realising that perhaps some of the things he's participated in the past haven't been as good as he thought they were. Whereas in The Offing we're following this young 17-year-old boy who has decided after all his exams at school is finished, before he has to start working in the coal mines, which is what his father and his father before him has done, he's going to go walking round the English countryside and just see the sights. and he quite quickly stumbles across a cottage by the sea where an older woman called Dulcie lives. And Dulcie is clearly very moneyed, she's very posh and intelligent and eccentric, and basically everything that our protagonist has never known before. Like, he's never met anybody like Dulcie, and he ends up staying with her for a period of his summer, and sort of everything about his worldview shifts, and that's really how I felt about the remains of the day. Both these characters are at a time in British history when so many things were changing, when all these notions we'd had about class and wealth and land ownership just couldn't stay as they were after the war. There wasn't the money for all these people who sort of lorded it over everybody to continue to do that. And also, after so many people from working class backgrounds had, you know, given their lives to fight in this war, they felt like they were owed something, and they fought to have it. And we're watching these characters from these really different backgrounds realise all that. And, you know, with the butler in The Remains of the Day, he's looking back on the past and having all these regrets, whereas in The Offing, the 17-year-old protagonist is looking forward and considering that this really narrow scope he thought his life could be, actually there's a possibility that could just open up, and all these other things could happen, and Dulcie allows him to think all that, and it is just a beautiful book. I also think that these books have a similar writing style in the level of detail, the descriptions of how rooms look and food, I think is really well done in both these books. And I just think thematically, if you enjoyed one, you're definitely going to enjoy the other. I'd be surprised if you don't. Next we have one of probably the most popular books ever, and I haven't actually read this book since I was 16, which is 16 years ago, so I should probably reread this one, and that is The Secret History of Madonna Tartt. This book is like famous, like everybody's read it, and if they haven't, they probably know what the plot is by now. I'm going to have to try and remember this off the top of my head after 16 years, although I've heard a lot of people talk about it in the meantime. The premise of this is that we're following a group of, shall we call them friends? People who think they're friends, acquaintances is probably a better term, who are studying, I think, classical civilization, something like that, at university. They're all very pretentious and like elite, and they sort of pull themselves away from everybody else and hold themselves above the others. And the book opens with you knowing that one of them has died, and you know how they died. And then the book widens to you looking back and seeing how they got there. And this book is pretty dark and twisty, looks at some quite unkind people, and also if you've read Donna Tartt, you know that she just has this rich, decadent writing style. Everything is just dialed up to 11, and I always felt like I didn't think anybody could write like her, and when people would write like comps on books like Donna Tartt, I'd be like, no, I think it is. It might be like Donna Tartt thematically, but it won't be like Donna Tartt in writing style. And this next book is like Donna Tartt in writing style, I think, although perhaps not as much in plot. This is a very different plot, and that is White Ivy by Susie Yang. I adore this book. I read it last year and it was one of my favourite reads of the year. So in this book we follow Ivy, who is our protagonist, and she is a Chinese immigrant who has a really interesting life, okay? So at the start of the book we follow her when she's a teenager, and we see how she feels herself to be above her family, and because her father is a caretaker at a private school, she gets to go there free. Most of the other students are white and they come from very wealthy families, and she becomes obsessed with this young boy who she views as like embodying the all-American boy, like that golden archetype, and she's really obsessed with him. And then we jump forward to many years later when she is like in her early 30s, I think, and she stumbles across this man again. And she's at a point in her life when she's sort of acting her life out. She's thinking about who she wants to be and how she wants others to view her, and she's just acting, like everything's a front. And she meets this man and like things happen, and I don't really want to spoil anything, and yeah, we follow her from there. And you could argue that Ivy is not a likeable character, but yet I really liked her. I usually find characters who don't know who they are and are sort of struggling with their identity quite difficult to read, because I don't like people who feel sort of listless and sort of let things happen to them. But Ivy's the opposite. She doesn't know who she is because she's grown up in a country where she hasn't felt welcome, where she's always felt othered, And so she doesn't know who she is because she refuses to inhabit the space society expect her to, and instead she's aimed for like the top. She's aimed for like the all-American dream, and she wants people to completely ignore that her race exists. And so she does. And so there is no lethargy to her character because, yes, she doesn't know who she is, but she sure as hell knows who she wants to be, and so that's who she will be. And yeah, this book is beautifully written, like completely in my mind as close to Donna Tartt's writing as I've ever read. Really decadent, sumptuous, everything feels dripping with money and like with wealth, and then you know that Ivy isn't, so she's just like faking it until she makes it. And I don't want to spoil anything, but this book is dark. It gets pretty fucked up. You watch Ivy do things and you're like, why are you doing this? Like, this is awful. But it really looks at how far somebody will go to inhabit a space they perhaps wouldn't otherwise if they weren't faking it, which I think really reminds me, from what I remember, of our main narrator in this book. He doesn't really feel like one of them, like one of this group, but he sort of fakes it until they believe he does belong. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've read this one, but read this one. It's such a great book, and I think it needs more people to read it and talk about it. And then lastly, I'm going to mention Lanny by Max Porter. Now, I actually didn't love this book. I think I gave it like 3.5 stars, although I can see where lots of people really did. This book is like beautifully written. The descriptions of the land and nature are like peak, and there's lots of discussions of like folklore. There's a character who sort of represents, I guess, the Green Man in British mythology, and this book is written in like a vignette style, but we get the voice of a community. And the book this really reminded me of is Reservoir 13 by John McGregor, and I heard quite a few people talk about this when it came out, but nowhere near as many people as I heard talk about Lanny. And I think these books are super similar. So the premise of Reservoir 13 is that some young girls go missing in this small area and it's never solved, and then we come back many years later to this area and we just hear perspectives from all the people in this area, which is exactly what Lanny is. I mean, so part of the story of Lanny is that Lanny goes missing, and you're sort of watching the show as to how all the community reacts when a young child goes missing in their area. And Reservoir 13 is about a very similar thing. You know, these young women, I think, go missing, and it's about how everybody reacts. But what Reservoir 13 does, which Lanny doesn't, is Reservoir 13 asks the question, well, what will happen to these communities in years to come? And we keep coming back and seeing how affected all these people are, and how it becomes like this sort of infamous thing about that area, and they're the village where the young girls went missing. And both books are told in this vignette style. Both books are really lyrical. Like I said, both of them excellent nature writing. I think if you enjoy one style, you'll enjoy the other. The difference, I think, in these two books, like I said, is not only that Reservoir 13 goes further in terms of time and that sort of like mythos of a town, it looks at that for many years. Also, what it lacks that Lanny has is, I guess, like the weirdness. Like, Lanny leans into mythology, the Green Man, and Reservoir 13 doesn't have that, although at times it does feel magical just because of how beautiful the writing is. I remember there's like a scene where he describes like all the animals like waking up for the day, and it's just like brilliant, like peak nature writing. So I really think if you enjoyed Lanny and you're okay with reading about a similar topic but without like the magic, but leaning more heavily in the discussion of how that sort of crime would affect a village, then I definitely think you should give this one a go, because I really enjoyed it. So those are the 10 books I would like to recommend based on 10 more popular novels. I'd love to know if you've read, or how many of the 10 popular novels have you read? I would love to know. Also, please tell me if you've read any of the others. But yeah, let me know if I've convinced you with any of these, if you've read the duo of any of these, and if you agree with me. And also, if you have any like duo recommendations, I'd love to hear them down below. Thanks for watching. Bye.